Good day, everyone. I am Jelly K. M. Lentija, and we are the reporter together with my groupmates, Miss Madanza and Miss Seno. Our topic is all about the declarative procedural model, or a neurobiological motivated theory of first and second language by Michael T. Hallman. The declarative and procedural memory play roles in language. These are arguably the two most important long-term memory systems in the brain in terms of the range of functions and domains that they subserve. Let's move to the theory and its construct. In this section, first present an overview of the two memory systems and how they interact with each other, and then I examine prediction for language that follow from this knowledge of the memory system. Although I focus on prediction for second language, I explicitly compare the second language and first language since the prediction for second language are intimately bound up with those for first language. Before we delve into the two memory system, however, I will first provide a quick tour of the brain as an overview of the necessary neurobiological basis. Let's move to the part of the brain. The brain is composed of the three, which is cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. First, I will explain it to the cerebrum. So, cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's composed of the right and left hemisphere. It performs higher function like interpreting touch, vision, and hearing, as well as speech, reasoning, emotion, learning, and fine control of movement. So, the cerebrum is the main important to our brain. If this part of our brain damaged or broke it, possible we cannot learn how to speak our first and second language, and etc. So next, cerebellum is located under the cerebrum. Its function is to coordinate muscles, maintain posture and balance. This cerebellum, this is the part of our brain under cerebrum. It means siya yung nagko-coordinate to our muscle movement. Next, brainstem acts as a relay center connecting the cerebellum and cerebellum to the spinal cord. It performs many automatic functions such as breathing, heart rate, body temperature, wake up and sleep, and swallowing. The cerebrum is divided into two halves, which is the right and left hemisphere. For example, if a stroke occurs on the right side of the brain, your left arm or leg may be weak or paralyzed. So, let's talk about types of lobe and each function. First is frontal lobe. Frontal lobe, they give a personality, behavior, emotion, judgment, planning, problem solving, speech, speaking, and writing, and body movement. And while parietal lobe, it interprets language, words, sense of touch, pain, temperature, interprets signals from vision, and etc. While occipital lobe interpret vision like color, light, movement, while temporal lobe understanding language, memory, hearing, sequencing, and organization. So, in general, the left hemisphere of the brain is responsible for language and speech, and it's called the dominant hemisphere. Remember that the right hemisphere plays a large part in interpreting visual information and spatial processing, and left-handed people may need special testing to determine if their speech center is on the left or right side prior to inner surgery in that area. So next is declarative memory. Declarative memory brainstem has been intensively studied in both humans and animals. The hippocampus and other medial temporal lobe structures are critical for learning and consolidating new knowledge in this system. Declarative memory, also referred to as explicit memory, is the memory of facts, data, and events. For example, let's say that you know that your favorite restaurant is only open until 6 p.m. on Sunday. The time that the restaurant closed is stored as a declarative memory. We can consciously recall the declarative memory. Procedural memory. Although procedural memory is not as well understood as declarative memory, the workings of this memory system are becoming clearer. The system is composed of a network of interconnected brain structures rooted in a frontal, basal, and ganglia circuits. Procedural memory is a type of implicit memory which aids to performance of particular types of tasks without conscious awareness of these previous experiences. Example, riding a bike, tying your shoes, and cooking an omelette. Interaction between the memory system. Declarative and procedural memory also interact with each other. First, with important consequences for L2 learning, the two systems can complement each other in acquiring the same or analogous knowledge, including knowledge of sequences and rules. Second, animal and human studies suggest that the two systems also interact competitively, resulting in a seesaw effect, which means seesaw effect is about theater or tutor. They demonstrate the linguistic process and called reduplication, where a word or syllable is doubled, often with a different vowel. Prediction of language. The DP model posits that the declarative and procedural memory systems should play roles in language that are largely analogous to roles they play in other domains. Linguistic prediction is a phenomenon in psycholinguistics occurring whenever information about a word or other linguistic unit is activated before that unit is actually encountered. Linguistic prediction is an active area of research in psycholinguistics and cognitive neuroscience. Prediction of declarative memory. Since declarative memory is important and perhaps necessary for learning arbitrary pieces of information and associating them, this memory system should be crucial for all learned idiosyncratic knowledge and language. Idiosyncratic knowledge can be defined as the typical use of a standard word or phrase to express a specific meaning. While the word used is part of the speaker's native language, it is not typically associated with the word or phrase of preference. And last but not the least, production of procedural memory. Given what we know about procedural memory, this memory system may be expected to underlie the learning and processing of sequences and rules in both first and second language. Those that are probabilistic may depend especially on this system. The system may be particularly important in learning to predict and language, such as predicting the next item in a sequence or the output of a linguistic rule. Only rules or sequences that are implicit should be learned by procedural memory. Given that grammar involves largely implicit rules, both probabilistic and deterministic, particularly ones that involve, or hierarchical sequencing, procedural memory should play a major role in this aspect of language. This should hold across linguistic subdomains, including syntax, morphology, and phonology.
Good day everyone, I'm Alfea Misi and Madansa, and I will discuss to you the prediction and interaction between the memory systems. Our understanding of interaction between the two memory systems also lead to prediction per language and is particular interest to second language. To some extent, we expect the two memory systems to acquire the same or analogous knowledge or skills to play at least partly redundant roles, as in non-linguistic domains. Such redundancy should be found for any task or function that can be supported by the system. Given the learning flexibility of declarative memory and the fact that this system can underlie implicit as well as explicit knowledge, we might expect it to be able to at least partly support most, if not all, linguistic functions that are learned by procedural memory, including grammar. Declarative memory could support such knowledge in a variety of ways, including storing rule-governed, complex forms as chunks which could be structured or unstructured, or learning rules which explicitly or implicitly. Take note, guys, that since learning and declarative memory improves during childhood up to adolescence and young adulthood, while learning and procedural memory seems to become less effective during this period because maybe due to the seesaw effect, which means can rapidly and repeatedly from one position and situation or condition to another. Young adult learners should on average. They rely more on declarative and less on procedural memory per grammar than child learners. Various factors should modulate which of the two memory systems is relied on more for linguistic knowledge that can be learned by either system. Such knowledge, in particular for grammar, should be learned first by declarative memory but more slowly and in parallel by procedural memory, which should eventually lead to highly automatized knowledge. It is worthwhile pointing that second language learner and adult first language learners are often compared in empirical studies. Learning trajectory points that is second language learner learned at either stages that second language learner. Even though grammar should eventually become at least somewhat proceduralized in both child and adult learners, this process should occur faster and more completely in children. Thus, even after years of exposure, adult learners may not attain the degree of proceduralization of their grammar as first language or early second language learners. So let us learn about several lines of relevant evidence. What counts as evidence? Multiple types of evidence can help test the prediction laid out earlier. This includes evidence from different methodologies, different language paradigms. Paradigms are natural languages or artificial languages from different tasks and different experiments. Now, let's learn about behavioral evidence correlational studies. Various types of behavioral evidence can be used to test the prediction of DP model. One of the most straightforward and initiative behavioral approaches is examining correlation across subjects between how well they learn in the memory system and how well they learn or process language. And for example, if people who are better at learning in declarative memory are also better at word learning, this may be taken to suggest that word learning depends on declarative memory. However, we have to be careful because correlation does not imply causation. A correlation between word learning and declarative memory could be explained not just by words being learned in declarative memory, but instead by some general cognitive process that underlies both word learning and declarative memory. One way to address this problem is to hold such other factors constant if one can identify them. Another way is to show the specificity of correlation. If word learning or processing correlates with declarative memory but not with procedural memory, this suggests that lexical memory has particular link to declarative memory that is not found with all learning systems. Moreover, if the converse holds, that is performance at grammar learning or processing correlates with learning in procedural but not declarative memory. This would further strengthen the specificity both of the relation of lexicon and declarative memory and grammar to procedural memory. And next, neurological evidence, the lesion method. If a person suffers from damage to particular brain structure and then loses the ability to carry out certain cognitive functions, one might infer that lost function previously depended on the damaged structure. By analogy, if you damage your lungs, you will have trouble breathing, whereas if you damage your stomach, you will probably have trouble in your digestions. This shows that one cannot perform these functions without these particular organs, and so these organs are necessarily for these functions. Using this approach to understand which brain structures normally underlie with function is referred to as the lesion method. For example, the fact that the lesion to the occipital lobes consistently lead to visual deficits supports the conclusion that occipital lobes are important for vision. Additionally, patients with lesions that extend to temporal neocortex should have trouble with second language grammar than with first language grammar. Conversely, patients with lesion to frontal basal ganglia circuits should have greater grammatical impairments in their first language than their second language. And in any such patients who have more than one second language, we should see evidence to greater grammatical impairment in the second language to which they had more exposure. On the other hand, if one tests a patient too quickly after a stroke or head injury, the loss of function can be much greater than attributable to the damaged regions, because nearby regions are often temporarily affected by a number of factors, as tissue swelling, usually waiting months or even a year or more after acute brain damage before testing a patient. And third, electropsychological evidence. Event-related potentials are measures of brain activity, specifically the electrical activity that constitute the basis of brain function. In an ERP study, just as in a sleep study measuring EEGs, electroencephalograms, electrical potential from brain activities are recorded from electrodes placed on the scalp. ERPs are simply the EEG activity that occurs right after a person hears or sees a word, sees a picture, and so on. Now, the presentation of such a stimulus is called an event. Hence, the name event-related potentials offer several advantages over some other methodologies. First, unlike functional neuroimaging methods like fMRI or PET and ERPs, provide excellent temporal resolution with millisecond measurement that allow one to examine the actual time course of language processing. On the downside, however, localizing the neuroanatomical source of ERPs in the brain is quite difficult. Second, ERP research has revealed a set of widely studied language-related ERP patterns in first language whose characteristic and underlying function are reasonably well understood. And lastly, functional neuroimaging evidence. Functional neuroimaging methods such as PET positron emission tomography, and the more common fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, have also been widely used to examine the neural basis of both first language and second language. These components thus provide a relatively clear way of comparing the neural cognition of language processing between L2 and L1, in particular for these language domains. Finally, ERPs can be sensitive for effects that are not actually observed with behavioral measures, including in language learning studies. They can potentially reveal first language and second language differences and similarities that might not be found with behavioral approaches. These techniques detect changes in blood flow (PET) or blood oxygen level (fMRI) that are known to correlate with changes in neuronal activity. For summary, functional neuroimaging can be used to test the DP model. The model predicts that word learning should show activation initially in MTL, including the hippocampus, whereas once words are learned, neocortical regions, especially in temporal lobe, should be more active. Grammar should also initially yield MTL activation. For example, if during grammar processing neurons fire particularly in the area of BA44, this region should show particular changes in blood flow and oxygen level, since firing neurons need more oxygen, suggesting that this region is especially important for grammar. This primary benefit of functional neuroimaging techniques in their excellent spatial resolution, allowing one to pinpoint activity to within a week's millimeters in the brain. In contrast, such changes in the blood are too slow to allow the detection of real processing changes, so unlike with ERPs, one cannot use functional neuroimaging to measure real-time language processing in the brain. This is my report. Thank you, and I give the floor to Ms. Seno.
Common misunderstandings. In here, we will address two common misunderstandings about the declarative and procedural model, and also discuss how this model differs from other neurocognitive perspectives of second language. We will discuss the various misunderstandings regarding the relation between the declarative and procedural memory systems on the one hand, and explicit and implicit knowledge on the other, in the section The Explicit and Implicit Debate. So first, there is a common misunderstanding regarding the domain generality of the two memory systems. On one hand, both systems are domain general in that they underlie multiple cognitive domains. However, this does not preclude subspecialization for language within either system, which could come about either evolutionary or during development. Indeed, evidence from other domains suggests that subspecialization can occur in both systems. For example, different portions and different regions of temporal neurocortex underlie different types of information. Likewise, different frontal or basal ganglia circuits observe different sorts of information. Nevertheless, at this time, there is no convincing evidence for domain-specific circuitry for language, either within structures involved in the two memory systems or elsewhere in the brain. Future research may further clarify this issue. Second, another common misconception is that the changes in the reliance of grammar from declarative to procedural memory are due to some sort of transformation of knowledge from one to the other system. This is not the case, but rather the two systems seem to independently acquire knowledge. Thus, proceduralization of grammar does not constitute the transformation of declarative into procedural representations, but rather the gradual acquisition of grammatical knowledge in procedural memory, which is increasingly relied on, with an accompanying decrease in reliance on declarative memory. Finally, to clarify any potential misconceptions regarding differences between the declarative and procedural model and other neurocognitive models of second language, we will compare models. The declarative procedural model lies within one of the three broad classes of neurocognitive models of second language. One class of models posits that the neurocognitive mechanisms underlying second language are essentially the same as those subserving. Second, it has been suggested that the mechanisms underlying second language are fundamentally different from those of the first language. So here, a third group of models hypothesized that second language learners initially depend heavily on different substrates than first language, but with increasing experience of or proficiency, gradually rely more on first language like neurocognitive mechanisms. This group of theories includes the views espoused by Paradis and by Claassen, as well as the declarative procedural model. Although these views are similar in certain respects, they also differ, and Paradis suggested that a shift between neurocognitive systems can take place both from rule-governed grammatical processes and at least some lexical properties, specifically grammatical properties of lexical items that are generally implicit in first language. Exemplary Study 2012. A major limitation of second language research that examines the second language learning trajectory is the time it takes learners to real high proficiency. This makes it impractical to examine subjects over the full course of language learning. As a result, the trajectory of learning has almost always been examined between groups of learners at different proficiency or exposure levels. However, like any between subjects design, this approach is not ideal. The difficulty in selecting and matching different subject groups on critical factors of second language exposure and use, let alone on the other factors that may influence language learning, can introduce noise and inconsistency, reducing confidence in the finding. As to address weaknesses, some studies have turned to artificial grammars or artificial languages. An artificial grammar typically involves presenting subjects with learner or tone sequences that are generated by some grammar. Artificial grammars can be learned to high proficiency quickly in minutes to hours. However, even though the rules of artificial grammars can be consistent with the rules of natural languages, they are not fully language-like since they lack vocabulary and the sequence have no meanings. Additionally, unlike a natural language, one does not speak or comprehend artificial grammars. Artificial languages address some of these concerns. An artificial language contains a small meaningful lexicon and a limited number of grammatical rules, generally consistent with those found in natural languages. The sentences have meaning and the language can be spoken and understood. Crucially, their small size makes them learnable to high proficiency within hours, allowing one to longitudinally examine the second language learning trajectory to high proficiency. Of observed findings in second language acquisition. First, exposure to input is necessary for second language acquisition, and a good deal of second language acquisition happens incidentally. As discussed earlier, the evidence suggests that not only is exposure to input necessary for learning and second language, specifically, more exposure and immersion experience may be critical for proceduralization of the grammar and the attainment of first language like neurocognitive grammatical processing. Observation. Second language learning is variable in its outcome, and the sixth was second language learning is variable across linguistic subsystems. According to the declarative and procedural model, both behavioral and neural correlates of second language learning should vary on the basis of multiple factors, including biological variables, input variables, and linguistic subsystems. Moreover, a number of these variables likely interact. Some of these factors have already been reasonably well examined, and indeed, the evidence suggests that they influence second language acquisition. A host of other variables should be examined in future studies. Ninth, observation. there are limits on the effects of instruction on second language acquisition. As we have seen, implicit and unstructured immersion like second language training appears to be more effective than instructed classroom-like training in the attainment of first language neurocognition of grammar. The explicit and implicit debate. At first blush, the distinction between the declarative and procedural memory brain systems seems to parallel that between explicit and implicit knowledge. Indeed, explicit knowledge is subserved only by declarative memory, while procedural memory underlies implicit knowledge. However, the parallel largely falls apart at this point. So first, the declarative and procedural model is based on claims about brain systems, whereas the explicit and implicit distinction is premised on claims about awareness. This latter distinction is somewhat problematic in that awareness is difficult not only to define but also to test. In contrast, the distinction between the declarative and procedural brain system is relatively clear, and the dichotomy can be tested, as we have seen, with a variety of methodological approaches. As we have seen, this brain system appears to be the only long-term memory system to underline explicit knowledge, a finding that is useful since it allows us to identify declarative memory as the locus of any long-term explicit knowledge. However, this system also underlies implicit knowledge, although declarative memory was historically associated only with explicit knowledge. Conclusion. The declarative procedural model appears to be a useful and informative theoretical approach. First, it is motivated by basic principles of evolution and biology. Second, it generates a wide range of behavioral and neurobiological predictions for both first language and second language, many of which would be unwarranted by the more limited study of language alone. Thus, it is a very powerful theory. Third, it is highly testable by multiple methods. Fourth, converging evidence from different methods and experimental paradigms support the basic predictions of the declarative and procedural model. So finally, the declarative procedural model likely has important applied implications. For example, the model seems likely to make useful predictions and offer explanatory accounts for factors that may lead to improvements in second language acquisition, the attainment of native-like processing, and the retention of what has been learned. One line of research seems particularly promising. Studies of memory have shown that a number of variables and interventions can lead to better learning and memory in brain memory systems. Not only intrinsic biological factors such as sex or genotype, but also external manipulations. That is, interventions such as space versus mass presentation. Declarative procedural model specifically predicts that if these techniques enhance learning and retention in declarative or procedural memory, they should also enhance language learning, including in second language acquisition.